Right, I've got a nice treat for all you lovely listeners out there, because today on the programme we have my dad. He's popped in to say hello.
Good morning.
And hello, Dad, how are you?
Not so bad at all, thank you.
Good man. Now, Dad, I'll call you Dad, but his real name's Trevor, but he is my dad and I love him dearly. I got him into the studio today to talk about his time with the BBC, the bastions of broadcasting. It was a longish time ago. How long ago was it when you were at the Beeb?
Well, I think I started around about 1957.
Right, and how old would you have been?
25.
25, yeah.
So, yeah.
25. And so you joined the Beeb, and what were you doing at the Beeb?
Well, we had to go through a series of different jobs according to the sort of engineering course that we were going on. Or it wasn't exactly a course, it was a job. And finally you were selected for the role that they thought you were best suited for.
So just to put some perspective on this, you were in the engineering department. So
I was in engineering.
On the technical side, as opposed to in an office somewhere doing research or anything like that.
I was classed as an engineer, but quite frankly it wasn't all that technical.
No. So what are
some of the things I had to do were quite amusing, really.
Now, I know you've...
By today's
standards, exactly, yes. And that's what I wanted to sort of get at, is really the comparison between how it used to be done, how programmes used to be produced on air. You were working in radio.
I was, yes, and sound studios.
Yes,
and in fact, the legacy of the war meant that there were still quite a few females still working in the BBC, because when the chaps had gone to war, they had to employ quite a lot of female people who wouldn't normally do those sort of jobs, such as going round and testing the audio equipment in all their different studios. And they had a lot in Broadcasting House, which is where we were. And I had to go round, and in fact I had to learn a lot of it from females. And it wasn't always in the daytime, it was shift work, so sometimes it was night time. Not that you could see that when you were inside.
So tell us what the studios used to be like at the BBC.
Well, I doubt whether they're all that different now. I mean, they had small theatres in there, and we had to go round and tap the microphones, make sure they were working. We had to play records. There were standard records. One of them was Peter the Wolf.
Right.
And the other one was a Teddy Bear's Picnic.
Yes.
And in the middle of the night, we used to put these records on at absolutely full blast, and the theatre was filled with the sound of Peter the Wolf or the Teddy Bear's Picnic, you see. And we used to listen and see make sure that there was no faults in the sound. Then we'd go from studio to studio. Some studios were quite small. And again, it was the turntables, the switching between studios, make sure they were working for the daytime, just as I say, the general audio equipment, which of course there wasn't an awful lot in those days. It was all fairly simple equipment, but
presumably quite big and bulky.
Well, yes. I mean, the records obviously were the old 78s and 33s.
Right. So you had turntables.
We had big turntables. We had beautiful turntables, lovely equipment. As you say, it was quite large.
Yes.
I mean, enormous desks we put them on. So it was extremely easy to use. But there were faults. And when we had a serious fault, we had to report it straight away.
So, presumably in 1957, most of the stuff was live. With some,
yes,
I imagine
there
that
was
there was
certainly
some
a lot of live stuff. Because another thing I did was to work in what they call the continuity suite.
Right.
I believe it's still called that.
Yeah.
You had the two little rooms side by side with a glass window separating them, and you had the chap in the continuity suite, which would be the announcer, and the man that came on and talked about the programme. And then in the next suite next to him was an engineer doing what he had to do. But we had to check both. And we also had to work in the continuity suites to some extent. We had to put the pips on, for example.
Right, okay.
And sometimes the bells. There were bells that rang.
Are you sure you weren't Quasimodo there working?
No.
What are the bells then? I mean, we all know the pips.
I'm just slightly recalling what it was exactly like. I believe I was talking about putting the bells on and so forth. Well, that was done in the engineering little room, where the continuity suite, other one, was where the announcer would sit. The engineer did the switching between studios, which is all done on a telephone system with large plugs and sockets, which you had to plug up. And you had to, you'd go in and you'd plug up for about 2 broadcasts in advance. And, for example, in the daytime, if you were working in the engineer next to the engineering suite, you'd plug up the programmes for about 2 or 3 hours in advance. So when I say plug them up, you'd have to sort of get them sorted between studios, because the programmes were going out from different studios.
Oh, I see. So you'd have like 2 or 3 studios, and that you've plugged up for each studio. So
you call up the studios, and I seem to remember that this may still be true. I don't know, but we were able in the master suite that we sat in to give the signals for starting and the programme. And we used to say to them on the telephone, you used to call them up and you say, "Now, are you ready?" "Yes." "Well, let's just test." And so you gave them, and you said, 2 flicks and a steady." "Yes, please." "Yes, please." So you gave them 1 or 2 flicks, and then that would check their light, and then a steady. Because the thing was that if their light didn't come on and the programme started, they wouldn't say a word.
Oh, I see.
In fact, you might even hear them talking. And this did happen sometimes.
So these 2 flicks and a steady.
Instead of a programme, you've got people laughing and talking between themselves.
So these are the sort of mic live to show that
there was a red
you were
light.
on air.
Somebody on that programme was looking up at the light and waiting for it to go, and they see the 2 or 3 flicks, they all go quiet.
Right.
And then when the steady comes on, they can get straight away. And this was all. Even the big orchestras had to wait for the lights like that, and then someone would come on and say what it was. I never forget, because when I was being shown as a very young raw engineer by an experienced man, supposed to be, the poor little chap was getting on a bit, and he was extremely nervous. He always seemed so nervous. He made mistakes himself, so you could imagine, really, it was hilarious.
So if you've got somebody who's in control of such important procedure, and you're looking over his shoulder, were you feeling nervous on his behalf?
Oh, yes, very nervous. Very nervous. It was such a responsible job, it made me feel very nervous.
It's good that we can laugh about it now.
Yeah. And then, of course, in the meantime, there was very often music that you had to check the music. The other thing, of course, was to check the level of the sound.
Yes.
We have 2 meters, and you adjust what they called the faders. We had a row of huge knobs inside the control, and you varied the levels by means of these faders. And that was, by the way, another thing that you checked with the studio before the programme went out.
So when you say knobs, I mean, you're talking quite large.
Quite large knobs, about 2 or 3 inches in diameter, which you could get hold of.
So nothing like...
Big meters in front of them, and you play a bit of music, and you watch where the needle goes. If it goes hard over, of course, it would come out distorted.
Yes.
And so on.
Yes.
Because I think we were talking about AM then and not FM.
Oh, yes, the frequencies and what have you. Great. So in the continuity there, I mean,
I did make a mistake once. Luckily, it was in the early morning. I know that I put the bells on top of a Scottish programme by mistake, and it came out over their programme. The music was playing and the bells. I realised, luckily, after about a minute or so, and turned them off. But there were lots of little small mistakes, and you often heard people talking in those days when they weren't supposed to be because of the system. It was only done by leads, old-fashioned leads with telephone plugs on the end.
It does seem very archaic.
That's why this chap was so nervous. You only got to plug it in the wrong hole, and you know, that's why you had to do these setups in the first place. You sat in there setting the whole thing up for 2 or 3 programs. But the other thing was that there was very little. There was a whole long time, maybe an hour or so. You're sitting there getting quite bored, listening to some music, but then, at the crucial moment, you had to switch into the news. At that moment, you had to act really fast.
Yes. So
in seconds, you had to switch something from something else, and this is when it got difficult. You had to concentrate what you were doing, but only in a short period of time.
Yeah. So you're waiting. Presumably, you've got cue sheets that are telling you when things are coming up.
You're flicking between stations. There could be 2 or 3 things happening very quickly. An announcement from somewhere. Some music from somewhere else, and something else from something, all just coming one very quickly after another. And that's when you had to do all this fiddling about inside. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. How long were you at the BBC then?
Oh, about 3 years.
And why did you leave?
Well, it was the shift work, really. That was the main thing. I did enjoy it there, but I didn't enjoy working at night and having to go home in the early hours and really not sleeping all that well. And that's
and where were you? Where were you living in relation to Broadcasting House?
Oh well, I had to have a train journey to North London.
Oh, so it was a bit of the whole thing was a bit of a trek.
Well, it was a bit of a trek, but of course, the underground and transport systems in the 1950s weren't the problems that they are now.
No. Buses ran on time.
Nothing worried you. There wasn't any of the problems that we've got now in transport and that sort of thing.
So was there a good feeling of camaraderie between you and the rest of the team?
Oh, yes, it was all very friendly. And you had people you worked with all the time. So, yes, it was...
Was there prestige about working at the BBC?
Well, there was a bit. You got to see the famous artists of the time coming in. For example, you couldn't put a face to the person which you know so well, like Mrs. Dale's Diary, for instance. I was in the lift once, and now I'm going to have to say that I can't remember the lady's name. But she was so famous, and I got into the lift, and I just started speaking to somebody. I realised who it was. I mean,
as soon as she
I had no idea, and it was the same with. And there was a person, a well-known, very, very well-known man called Gilbert Harding. He was well known for being a bit touchy, to say the least.
Yes.
And I remember going into his studio by mistake once. To do some checks, and he glared at me and bawled me out. And then when I heard the voice, once again I knew who it was, because voices were very well known in those days, but people didn't have television.
Yes.
The voices were ever so well known. And but the faces that went with them weren't, because there was no television.
No. So you could be talking to
somebody, and you knew who he was as soon as they spoke. But up until then, you could be anybody. Oh, yeah, that was quite interesting, yeah. There was another aspect to the job, and that was listening to the BBC's foreign correspondence.
Oh, right.
Now, there you sat in a very big room, and there was a chief engineer and another man who sat at a top desk in charge. And round the walls, there were lots of stations. Again, they were plugged up with big plugs and things, and wires connecting you to lines which presumably went out to transmitters, and they were talking to other transmitters abroad where the foreign correspondents were located. And we used to listen to their broadcasts, and we had to decide whether they were usable or not. And a large number of them were very poor, and we couldn't use them. And sometimes, the decisions had to be made by the top men at the top there, and we'd pass things through. They'd come listening to things, and there'd be awful fading, and the voice would completely disappear.
Oh, see, because of the nature of the transmission.
Yes, it was shortwave transmission, and there was no satellites then. So our correspondents were just talking on shortwave.
Right.
And of course, shortwave only works at certain times of the day, and there were things
down to
like
atmospherics
that.
and things like that.
They used lined lines where possible, but even those had all sorts of problems in the early days. Well, that was still fairly early days.